In a 2017 poll, the deep state was defined as military intelligence and government officials who try to secretly manipulate government policy. There are many individuals and organizations tied to the deep state that are pushing for an Article 5 constitutional convention. In 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book titled Between Two Ages: America's Role in the Technotronic Era. It praised Marxism repeatedly, and it also called for a national constitutional convention. Brzezinski wrote, "The approaching 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence could justify the call for a national constitutional convention to re-examine the nation's formal institutional framework. Either 1976 or 1989, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, could serve as a suitable target date for culminating a national dialogue on the relevance of existing arrangements, the workings of the representative process, and the desirability of imitating the various European regionalization reforms and of streamlining the administrative structure." Although we didn't have a constitutional convention in either 1976 or 1989, we did come close. It was Brzezinski's book that inspired deep state luminary David Rockefeller, the then chairman of the Globalist Council on Foreign Relations, to create the Trilateral Commission in 1973. Their overall goal is to bring together establishment insiders from North America, Western Europe, and Japan to deepen international cooperation and interdependence, first among themselves and afterwards with the communist countries of Europe and Asia, until ultimately they establish a one-world government, which they routinely describe as the New World Order. Shortly after the publication of Brzezinski's book and the creation of the Trilateral Commission, another book was published titled The Emerging Constitution. It was written by Rexford G. Tugwell, who was an avowed socialist. He was hired by the Ford Foundation to write a new constitution for America's 1976 bicentennial. The new constitution was for the so-called New States of America. This proposed constitution watered down individual liberties and state sovereignty, expanded the size and scope of the federal government, and allowed the president to assume dictatorial powers in the event of a national emergency, and would be ratified by a national referendum. The Constitution for the New States of America had little support. However, this was also when the push for a constitutional convention under the guise of proposing a balanced budget amendment, or BBA, started taking off. By 1983, there were 32 states with active applications to Congress to call for a constitutional convention, ostensibly to propose a BBA. One of the key figures to propose a BBA is David Walker, who was the Comptroller General and CEO of the Government Accountability Office from 1998 to 2008. Walker was also a member of the Trilateral Commission. In 2018, he co-founded an organization called Let Us Vote for a BBA, which is pushing for Congress to call a convention. The Convention of States organization, also known as COS, is lobbying state legislators to make application to Congress to call a constitutional convention, ostensibly to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. One of the members of COS Action's Legal Advisory Board is Robert P. George. He was also the author of the Conservative Constitution, a possible conservative replacement for the Constitution. George's Conservative Constitution is a disaster for liberty. It guts the Second Amendment and makes onerous federal gun control laws constitutional. Section 12 of the Conservative Constitution says, "Neither the states nor the United States shall make or enforce any law infringing the right to keep and bear arms of the sort ordinarily used for self-defense and recreational purposes, provided that states and the United States, in places subject to its general regulatory authority, may enact and enforce reasonable regulations on the bearing of arms and the keeping of arms by persons determined with due process to be dangerous to themselves or others." Based on this language, who exactly gets to decide what constitutes firearms ordinarily used for self-defense and recreational purposes? How would leftist lawmakers and future courts interpret what is meant by reasonable regulations? And who will be the one enforcing these reasonable regulations on the bearing of arms and the keeping of arms by persons determined with due process to be dangerous to others? The conservative Constitution was published on the National Constitution Center website in 2020. 2 years later, COS co-founder and president Mark Meckler participated in a roundtable discussion organized by Pennsylvania state legislators. While speaking to the state lawmakers, Meckler identified and touted Robert P. George as being on COS's legal advisory board. Of course, Meckler did not mention George's conservative constitution and how it guts the Second Amendment, nor did Meckler mention the fact that Robert P. George's name is listed on the membership roster of the Council on Foreign Relations. These are just some of the individuals with deep state ties who want to convince your state legislature to apply to Congress to call an Article 5 convention. Learn more about Article 5 and the amendment process by visiting jbs.org.